With that said, I will introduce our speaker. This is Pam Fruk. Fresh. No. Fruk, right? Frake. See, I got the pronunciation and then I forgot to write it down. I just knew it wasn't the first thing that came to mind. Pam, thank you so much for your grace with that. Appreciate it. So we're really happy that Pam can be here. Excuse me. She's the coordinator of the Justice for Workers campaign and an organizer with the Workers Action Center. And Pam has a lot of experience and a lot of stories to share as a longtime labor and social justice activist. So we are really thankful that you're here, and I'm happy to mute myself now and learn from you.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me, and thank you all for sharing your Saturday morning with me. Maybe I'll just start by making sure I share screens properly here. So I'll just do that and see if everybody can see the slides. And then I should also just make sure I can advance the slides as well. So let me just double check that I can do that. Yes. Okay, good. All things are set.
Looks great.
So yeah, one of the things that I think we're really confronted with in 2022 is just this enormous crisis of distribution of resources, where we have unprecedented numbers of billionaires, and yet food insecurity seems to be growing around the world, where there's tremendous inequity from access to vaccines, access to food security. We have obviously the climate crisis. It seems like we have, we're facing multiple crises. And, from my perspective, I think that the kind of work that is allowed to be fostered in our global system is a really crucial site of struggle, because as we're going to see through the presentation, billionaires don't exist by the sweat of their brow. Billionaires can only exist when they are able to take from everybody who produces the wealth more than the value of the wealth they produce. And that's the fundamental contradiction. And to my mind, I don't think we need billionaires to make the world a kinder, gentler place. I think what we need is for all people to live in dignity with, health and wealth and, adequate wealth and so forth. So just to say, at present day, if we even just looking at Ontario, work really matters. Like, it structures all aspects of our lives, where we live, the kind of shelter we have, and we know rents are exorbitant these days, and the income that we have determines what kind of shelter we get. It shapes access to food and the quality of food we get. It determines the kind of work can often determine whether we even have access to medicine. It determines whether we have access to education. And it also determines our health in the present. It determines our health in the future. It shapes our time with family. It shapes our children's future. And it shapes the possibility, even whether or not we're going to be able to retire, and then the quality of retirement. So work is a fundamental site of struggle, and many of our laws do nothing to get at the structural sources of precarious employment. And something else I want to say about work is that racism is real, gender discrimination is real, disability discrimination is real, and that means the way that it plays out in the labor market is favoritism to those of us who are white, who are able-bodied, who may have the male identity and so forth. So what it really means in practice is the worst jobs are allocated for those who face the most discrimination in society. And we may have heard during COVID that, racialized communities had worse worse health outcomes in the matter of COVID, but it's not because of anything genetic or because of racism, but it's about a race per se. It's about racism and how it manifests itself into very material circumstances, that people are more likely to die from COVID because of all the structural things that we just talked about. They're more susceptible to it because when the pandemic struck, we saw all kinds of frontline workers forced into very dangerous work. And if you think about it, who kept us going you know, it wasn't the Bay Street lawyers that kept us going. It was the migrant workers that grow our food. It was the transportation workers, the grocery store workers, the delivery workers, the warehouse workers. They kept us alive. And yet those were the very workers who were the least paid, the fewest protections on the job, not even basic paid sick days. And I have to say, I am stunned that we still yet do not have employer paid sick days for all workers. So just to say, not only is work an important site of struggle, it's actually an important site of racial, gender, and disability justice as well. So the irony of all of this is that despite how precarious our work is and so invisible so much of our work is, and you know, how dangerous our jobs are, workers produce everything. Like, we literally produce everything. Nothing could be done. Like this glass of water that I'm holding, that's slightly fuzzy now, that, you know, it took somebody to make the glass. It took somebody to filter the water. Like, nothing at all is possible without work. And so the need to value it appropriately is crucial. Meanwhile, we have these billionaires that are literally wasting resources, sending people into outer space. It's just, which is also a climate disaster. I'll just mention that. So it's pretty despicable. And the irony of all of this is that they know that the least paid workers paid for all of this excess. They know it. And so unselfconscious are they that they had, Jeff Bezos had the audacity to thank his frontline workers who are being harmed and maimed and underpaid and facing, you know, risk every single day on the job. It's really quite despicable. And I think one of the challenges that we encounter when we talk about improving work and wages is the notion that somehow if we are to raise wages, it's going to hurt small business owners, or it's going to hurt the economy, or somehow it's going to be harmed. And maybe, you know, maybe what I'll do is, just before I get into the next slide, if anyone wants to unmute and shout out any of the myths they've heard around what happens if we were to raise the minimum wage. Can anyone either shout out or put in the chat what they've been hearing about wage increases?
If we raise the minimum wage, then robots will take our jobs.
Oh, that's an excellent one. How many? Yes, that notion that, well, it's you know, kiosks, that they'll just get rid of you know, fast food workers and replace them with kiosks or robots or whatever. What are some other myths that people have heard about raising what'll happen if we raise wages? And I apologize that now that I'm screen sharing, for some reason I can't find the chat function. So I can't see the chat. So you'll have to unmute and shout out. Oh, there, wait a second. I found the chat, always a good thing. Oh yeah, oh, this is great. So Lisa's saying, I've heard Tim Hortons owners say that if I raise wages, my shop will close. That's a very good one too. Has anyone heard the myth that if I raise wages, somehow there's going to be fewer jobs? Yeah. Well, just to say, some of you may be surprised to learn that small business owners are far more likely to pay well above minimum wage and to provide paid sick days, far more likely than big corporations like Walmart and Amazon and Loblaws and so forth. Can anyone guess why that might be the case? And again, put it in the chat because I've now found it, or you can unmute and shout out. Oh yes, and Lisa's saying that she heard this myth from somebody who actually owns 7 Tim Hortons franchises. Somebody's saying it might be harder to retain workers if they don't. Brilliant. That's exactly right. You can imagine a place like Walmart where they have whole public, you know, personnel departments. So if there's a revolving door of workers, you know, coming in and then leaving because the first better job that comes along, they're going to take it. They can cope with that because they have a whole personnel department for that. Whereas small business owners, their staff are their ambassadors for their goods, for the goods they sell or the services that they provide. So you can't afford to have sick workers, uninspired workers on the front lines. And so often small business workers are the biggest supporters of raising the minimum wage. And in fact, a survey that we did when we first launched the campaign showed not only that 2/3 of small business owners supported raising the minimum wage, at least 1/3 of those felt that it should be significantly higher. And at the time we were asking about the $15 minimum wage. And like I say, 2/3 supported that. And a substantial minority within that said it should be much, much higher. Because that's the thing, a small business owner has to compete with Walmart. And if Walmart can handle, low wages and economies of scale, there's all these huge advantages for big corporations. Small business owners have to pay their employees more because they need them over the long term, and they can't afford to have them walking out the door the moment a better job comes along. They can't buy in the same quantity. So there's all sorts of disadvantages that small business owners face compared to corporations. And what more and more small business owners are saying is that we want the government to legislate an even playing field so that Walmart has to pay proper wages the same way small businesses have to pay proper wages. And that's going to level the playing field. So these are some really good myths. But I also want to just take on a little bit of a myth that this notion, and it's like one of the reasons why I think people think that it's going to be impossible for businesses to pay more, is that people really believe that that businesses pay workers as much as they possibly can without going out of business. And this is an observation by an economist, a US-based economist, Benjamin Studebaker, who really takes on the myth that somehow if we raise the minimum wage, it's going to cause price increases or inflation, and so forth. And so what he observes, he says, the notion that higher wages will cause inflation or other harms to the economy relies on the assumption that firms who pay their workers the maximum amount they can possibly pay while staying in business, so that any increase in wages necessitates raising prices or they're going to go out of business. And what Studebaker says is that this could not be further from the truth. Firms do not try to maximize wages, they try to maximize profits. And the result of this is that to maximize profits, firms need to minimize labor costs, not maximize them. And so the firms, the richest firms, are paying their workers with the least amount that they can get away with. And I think the comedian Chris Rock once said, you know what it means if your boss pays you the minimum wage? It means they'd pay you less if they could. And I thought that was a very astute observation. So just to help ourselves get our minds around this, I think this is a really important point to take on, that it is actually possible to pay workers more. And just to give you a flavor of who the biggest outcry came from in Ontario when we did get legislation that would have led to a $15 minimum wage, it was none other than Galen Weston, who said, "Dear Lord, I cannot afford to pay $15 an hour. This is going to be disastrous," and so forth. And so, yeah, this is a guy who's, at the time, his net worth was $8.2 billion. And that's just his personal wealth. That's not his family wealth and his father and so forth. So there is a real, there's a lot of myths behind, how wages impact the economy. Lately we have this issue of inflation, and a lot of, corporations are warning against wage demands that are far too high. They're warning that if wages go up, it's going to just accelerate inflation. But I think we need to unpack what is really causing inflation in the current moment. And I think, COVID-19, when you think about what happened, millions of workers were struck down with illness around the world. Many workers died around the world. It was a devastating disease. It resulted in all sorts of closures of factories that stopped production, sent people home to try to contain the disease. And many of you may have heard of just-in-time production. So what that means is that corporations now don't have a lot of supplies on hand. They try to order just as much as they need, and that's really increased the pace of productivity and so forth. And so if you get a bottleneck where suddenly a manufacturing plant can't manufacture what it once was producing, or the ships can't get, you know, around the world as fast as they used to because there's fewer workers and there's fewer things being produced, you can imagine that begins to have a really big impact on the price of goods and services. And just as an illustration, I included the actual bottleneck of the Suez Canal. That the Suez Canal is like a, you know, it's like a major transportation hub, and about $8 billion of global wealth goes through the Suez Canal. And there was an actual ship that got stuck during COVID that created this massive bottleneck. So it's a good, you know, visual analysis of what actually happened during COVID. So that's a huge contributor to rising prices, because when goods are scarce, when the shipping takes longer, when production has been reduced, that makes the price of things higher. The other thing that has happened is the war in Ukraine and the massive increases in energy prices. So that is a huge contributor, obviously, to inflation. But then we also have climate change. And, you know, we've heard about the droughts, we've heard about the fires, we've heard about the floods, but less discussed is the impact on food production. Because when climate crises wipe out food crops, that has the effect of creating scarcity, and that has the effect of raising the price of food. So those are all things. And then, of course, the thing that must be talked about in today's context is the pandemic profiteers. And this is something where I think it's important for us to spend a little bit of time on. It is stunning how many billionaires have multiplied their wealth during COVID, when so many of us lost our income, when so many of us were losing family members. And, you know, and Canada is not immune from this crisis of distribution. This was just 6 months into the pandemic that Oxfam published these staggering figures. Oxfam was able to show that the wealth of the 10 richest men grew by $500 billion 6 months into the pandemic, 6 months after, you know, everyone was sent home and we're told to stop producing. Basically, 9.5 billion is how much Canadian billionaire fortunes grew last year, and by last year they meant 2020. And in Canada, a chief executive officer could earn the same amount of money a full-time nurse does in 2 days. And basically, it would only take a few hours for that same CEO to earn what a minimum wage earner makes in a year. So this is really a huge problem. So when they say there's scarcity, and when they say that, you know, education workers shouldn't get their $3.25 wage increase, it is absolutely scandalous, because not only is the money there, it should be taxed, wages should be increased, and we should be really curbing the ability of billionaires to get away with such excess. And here's where I want to just to give you a sense, because I don't know about you, but numbers stick in my head. 1 million and 1 billion and 1 trillion, they all live in the same spot in my brain, which is the spot that says, wow, that's a big number. So this guy, Humphrey Yang, did some really interesting little videos where he talked about what wealth looks like if we were to count it in grains of rice. So I'm going to just stop sharing for 1 second, and I'm going to go, and then I'm going to share again the videos. So let me just get organized here. Boom. Okay, now I'm going to share again. Okay, here we go. Watch and listen to this. Okay. Oh, you know what? I know what's happening. I forgot to share sound. Sorry, gang. Okay, boom. I know what's happening. Yes, share sound. Okay. Okay, technology. There we go.
crazy. So let's say the scale of $1 billion is really crazy. So let's say 1 grain of rice is equivalent to 100K, and 10 grains of rice would be then 1 million. Well, how much is 1 billion? So my Saturday night consisted of counting 10,000 grains of rice one by one, just to show you guys how much $1 billion is. Of course I filmed it, and of course I time-lapsed it, and this is playing at, I don't even know, God knows how fast it's playing at, but. So now I'm proud to present to you the results. That is $1 billion, where each grain of rice is worth 100K. Look how much rice this is, guys. That's crazy. I just bought you like a Lamborghini right here, and I didn't even notice it was gone. Here's a $5 million house in California, and oh look, I still have all this money. If you guys like that content, please follow me. I drop a video on personal finance every day. Thanks.
Okay, so that's just a conception of what $1 billion actually looks like. Let's look at Jeff Bezos. Oops.
It was $100,000. In my last video, I counted 10,000 grains of rice, where each grain of rice was $100,000. And that was to show you the scale of $1 billion. Well, a lot of you guys asked me, well, how much does Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos have in terms of rice? So that was my mission. I went to Target, I bought a digital food scale, I came home, and then I weighed the rice that was worth 1 billion from earlier. I did the math in my head, and I went to Costco. I got the rice, I brought it home, and once I brought it home, I went to work. I also want to say that I have 5 families that are going to take this unused rice, so it's totally not wasteful. Okay, so the moment you've been waiting for, 100K, 1 million, 1 billion, Jeff Bezos has 122 of these, or 58 pounds of rice. If each grain of rice was 100K. Like, look how big this is, guys. I'm gonna show you the scale here. I'm gonna put a keyboard in just for fun. Look how deep that goes. That's insane. This is Jeff Bezos' new house that's $145 million in LA. And then, oh my God. In my last video, I counted 10,000 grains of rice.
And that was Jeff Bezos before the pandemic. Now we're going to do Jeff Bezos after the pandemic.
Jeff Bezos is that back in February, I made a video that went viral visualizing Jeff Bezos' then net worth of $122 billion in rice. Well, that was then. Since then, his net worth has gone up $50 billion to $172 billion. So what does that look like? Let's not forget our principles here. So 1 grain of rice is $100,000, and that's what $1 million looks like. It's 10 grains of rice. $50 billion is the net worth that Jeff Bezos has added since February of 2020. Now, this is about a 24-pound pile of rice, and I have his original pile of rice laid out over there, which I'm going to add the two, and we're going to see how big this thing actually gets. So here we go, $172 billion in rice, where each grain of rice is $100,000. It's a lot bigger than his previous pile back in February. I mean, look, it's almost, it's just crazy. This is always pretty fun. Here's a $2 million house or 10 Tesla SUVs. And as you can see, it's not gonna make a dent in his old pile or his new pile. If you enjoyed that, make sure to follow me because I make videos on money and personal finance.
So you can see scarcity is not a problem. Did any of you find that shocking? And I'm just looking at the chat now too. Oh, I'll check out the link that you sent. I totally appreciate that, Josh. And Peter makes the point that Amazon is anticipating running short of workers. And I think that's a really important point that you raised. The so-called labor shortage, like what I think has been happening, what happened during COVID, certainly for the restaurant industry, is that workers found that they just didn't pay enough to keep them alive. Like once you create an economic crisis and people can't survive on tips, because let's face it, that's generally what restaurant workers rely on because the wages are so low. What people found out is that they just can't live. They literally cannot continue to live on that amount of money. So that many workers went back to school, retrained, and are looking for jobs elsewhere that are going to pay a little bit more. So this labor shortage is not exactly a labor shortage. Like as a child once said to her unemployed father, who was saying, I can't find work. And the daughter said, gee, Dad, does that mean all the work is done? And of course, the work is not done. There's plenty of work that needs to get done, but but corporations don't want to pay more. They don't want to raise wages and improve working conditions, although that conversation is now starting to happen, but many of the big corporations are trying to find other ways of creating insecurity and precarity for workers so that they have even less choice in the labor market. And you can see what the federal government did, where they introduced CERB, which was such an important thing, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, and that kept people afloat. It was actually fantastic that everybody got $500 a week. But what they began to do is to cut it and reduce it, and then finally eliminate it, so that it drives people into the worst jobs and takes away any possibility that they have choice in the labor market. So rather than improving wages and working conditions, corporations are lobbying to create laws that will make workers more precarious, not less. So that's why, and I'm glad you enjoyed the video, because for me, that was very helpful, because like I say, I can't really mentally tell the difference between a million, a billion, and a trillion and all of that business, but that really made it clear for me. So this is our agenda for decent work. So, we already talked about racism in the labor market and so forth, but our demands that we have, and this slide is just a summary of our 10 basic categories that we're fighting for to change the legislation. And I'm just going to quickly blow through these to show how they're all connected to getting at the structural sources of precarious employment, so that we can actually raise wages and improve working conditions for everyone. And so I'll just blow through these really quickly. So first off, we talked about racism and other forms of discrimination, but that's really important. And we need to support the human rights tribunals, and we need a more effective space in society for people to address these concerns. But also, if we fight for a higher minimum wage, if we fight for equal pay and so forth, we are actually making life better for people who face racism and discrimination in the labor market. The other point I want to make, especially with the question of the labor shortage, is that the absolute need to make sure that every human being has full rights under the law is crucial. What the federal government has been doing for years and years and years is creating a whole hundreds of thousands of people who are in really precarious circumstances and who are dependent on their employer for their livelihood. And so they have very little agency without the threat of deportation. For many workers, it's the threat of job loss. But if you're a migrant worker without citizenship status in this country, it's not just the threat of losing your job, it's the threat of deportation and what that means for your family. And so we're basically saying that every migrant should have permanent residency status, and that means that they'll have full rights and protections under the law. And that's a really big and important part of our campaign. We also need a $20 minimum wage. And if you can believe it, well, maybe I'll do a little shout out. Can anyone guess what the minimum wage is for farm workers? So you can either put it in a video or unmute and shout out. Anyone want to guess? Right now, the minimum wage was just adjusted in Ontario to $15.50. So who can guess what the minimum wage is for farm workers? And no idea too out there. So type it in the chat, unmute and shout it out.
I'll guess $8.
$8. Good guess. Does anyone want to guess again? Anyone? Lisa. Bing, 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 bing. Lisa, you're exactly right. There is no minimum wage for farm workers. So can you guess who comprises mostly farm workers? Migrant workers. And why is that? It's because the federal government, by unfair immigration laws, has created a workforce that face multiple layers of precarity, and it's much more difficult for them to organize to improve working conditions. And not only is there no minimum wage law, there's no break, they're exempted entirely from the Employment Standards Act. So there's no break regulations on breaks, there's no vacation pay, there's nothing. There's no regulation of farm workers. And that's, again, like, you know, if people had full rights, they could be organizing, they could be forming unions, they could be fighting together to change and improve the laws. So this is where the structural sources, it's not like, wow, you know, precarious work will always be with us. It's actually embedded right in the law. And if we make those legislative changes, we can have a dramatic improvement in the working conditions of millions of workers. Decent hours, you know, this is a very basic issue. It's an issue that the education workers are fighting for right now. You know, you might get a decent hourly wage, but if you're only working 12 or 14 or 17 hours a week, you can't make ends meet on it. And one of the things that we saw during COVID in long-term care homes is that because long-term care homes have a deliberate business strategy to hire workers at part-time contracts, not full-time, many long-term care workers had to go from nursing home to nursing home to nursing home to be able to make ends meet with their employment. And of course, what that meant with people who are vulnerable, who have no paid sick days, it meant that long-term care homes were a really, you know, tragic source of COVID-19 outbreaks. And actually what we learned, and in fact, there was an excellent Toronto Star article just published the other day, and I'll paste it in the link afterward, but workplaces were key vectors that spread COVID into all of our communities. And so we really learned that workers need, one job needs to be enough. It needs to have a high enough hourly wage and enough hours a week that one job can be enough so that workers don't have to cobble together a string of jobs in order to make ends meet. And the way we propose to do that is that, but it is true, sometimes sometimes employers can't provide full-time jobs, and we recognize that. But if they are going to hire another worker and they have a whole series of part-time workers, we propose that employers first offer the additional hours to existing workers. And then if those workers have the right of first refusal, then they can hire another part-time worker, because sometimes workers do choose to work part-time, and I'll touch on that in the next couple of slides. How many of you would be surprised to learn that some nurses did not have paid sick days during COVID? Is that a surprise to any of you? Oh, I see someone's not surprised. I have to say, it blew my mind. I learned only during COVID that part-time nurses, even emergency room nurses, do not get paid sick days. And a lot of part-time workers, even if they're in a union, don't get paid sick days. It literally never occurred to me that health workers working in the emergency rooms dealing with COVID would not have paid sick days. It's just mind-boggling. And so that's still an issue. We still don't have 10 employer paid sick days, and we need to make sure that those paid sick days that workers have seamless access to it, because these schemes, oh yeah, and yeah, Vark is saying nurses' salaries in Ontario were capped at 1%. And yes, and all kinds of public workers have had their salaries capped. And I only just learned recently about the education workers that they were first to have their wages capped. So their wages have been capped at below inflation for 11 years. So it was like first the education workers and then the rest of the public sector workers. Like and then here we have like almost double-digit inflation. Like it's just literally unbelievable. But a basic demand of paid sick days, what wound up happening in warehouses and in factories is that workers who have very little wages, and they have to choose between losing a day's pay, and being able to put food on the table, or maybe losing their housing. And so a lot of workers might have felt that they have symptoms, but they went to work hoping for the best because they couldn't afford to lose pay. And these schemes that the provincial government enacted, and even the federal sickness benefits, it really meant that workers would have to take the day off in the present and then apply for their benefits afterward. And yes, and Lisa, you're exactly right. Workers need paid sick days when their children are sick, or if they elder care. Like there's so many personal emergencies is really what we need. And that's why our demand is 10 employer paid personal emergency leaves that can be used for whatever people need. But this is exactly the case, that workers were forced to go to work even if they had COVID, and that had the effect of spreading it, but not because those workers are irresponsible, but because they're so responsible and they're trying to protect their shelter and their families and their children and so forth. And even I've talked to teachers who, sometimes forget that, that a lot of workers don't have paid sick days. And so they asked, just like Lisa was saying, why do parents send sick children to schools? Well, they do that because they don't have paid sick days themselves, or they don't have paid emergency leaves themselves. And so every time I help public health professionals, from Nova Scotia to British Columbia, is to say, if you have symptoms, stay the blazes home. Well, let's have laws that make it possible, because we won 2 paid sick days fighting for labor law reforms. But one of the first things that Doug Ford did when he got elected is cancel it. So even the 2 paid sick days that we had, Doug Ford canceled it. The $15 minimum wage, Doug Ford canceled it in response to people like Galen Weston and Loblaws and others. So Doug Ford sent workers into the pandemic with fewer protections, with less income, and it made the whole entire thing worse. So this is why paid sick days are very important. And maybe I should add here, in November, Peggy Sattler is a member of the New Democratic Party, and she has tabled paid sick days legislation. And so we're organizing a campaign to put pressure on every member of provincial parliament to support that legislation, because Peggy Sattler's bill will do exactly what this slide says: 10 employer paid sick days, plus an additional 14 days of paid leave during public health emergencies. And let's put an end to the notion of workers having to get a sick note. Every health provider tells you it just clogs our system and wastes resources. The next demand here is the idea of real protections for temp agency workers. And how many are any of you familiar with how the deal works for temp agency workers? If anyone wants to shout out or pop it in the chat. Oh, I see Louise has put her camera on. Do you want to take a try? No wrong answers.
Yeah, I was a temp worker once. and yeah, I got paid less than everybody else, and in the company, and I had no paid sick days, and I had like no benefits. I had no nothing, and I was really at the whim of the company. If they decided they didn't like the look of me, I'd get no notice and I'd be sent home.
Exactly. And imagine if you're injured on the job or harmed, and actually there was a series of deaths. Some of you may have heard about it at the Fiera Foods bakeries, where 5 workers have died in a 10-year period, killed on the job. And the reason, there's this really disgusting financial incentive for employers to offload their health and safety obligations to a subcontractor. So the way our safety and insurance board works is that if a corporation or a company or an employer has a workplace injury or death, the premiums increase. And so in order to avoid paying higher premiums, what the companies will do is they'll hire a temp agency to bring in workers. And the temp agency is technically the employer. So if there's an injury on the job or a death on the job, that temp agency absorbs the premium increase, but they can also just close down and start up under a new name, and there's no fuss, no muss. So there's this revolting incentive for companies to use temp agencies for literally the most dangerous work. And there's no incentive for proper training of the workers. There's no ability for the workers to get a proper return to work plan if they're injured and so forth. And many workers, wind up having to track down, who's the employer. And the irony is we fought for legislation that would make both the temp agency and their client company, the company that uses the temp agency workers, to make them jointly responsible for workplace injuries and deaths. And that is sitting in limbo right now. There is a law that the previous government brought in response to our campaign, but it needs to be signed into action by the premier. And Doug Ford now, despite a temp agency worker dying within 1 year of his getting elected, has failed to bring that legislation into existence. So it is literally there. It is an actual law, but it hasn't been enacted yet because it requires the premier's signature, and he has refused to do that because of his alliances with his corporate friends. So these are the things that we could do that would take away these structural sources of precarious work, because once both the client company and the temp agency are jointly responsible, then there's no financial incentive for a company to use temp agencies. They can just go ahead and hire workers directly. And the same goes for the issue of equal pay, because Louise, you talked about getting less pay because you're a temp agency worker. Have any of you had the experience of just, even if not going through a temp agency, but you're part-time and you're working beside somebody's full-time and you get less pay than the full-time? I see Melissa's. Yeah, do you want to tell your experience, Melissa?
Oh, just when I was getting started out of university, I was working full-time hours as a part-time employee. Yes. So I wasn't entitled to the benefits or the pay. And I've also had the temp experience as well.
So interesting. And and sometimes we think that that happens maybe in manufacturing plants, or maybe that happens in warehouses, but because it's legal to pay part-time workers less and provide fewer benefits, it's everywhere. And that's why so many union members didn't get paid sick days, because, oh, and I think I see someone, there's a raised hand. Daniel, do you want to,
when you're saying it's happening everywhere, I mean, my interest is I came out of a humanities PhD program, and the universities, you might think, oh, well, they're mighty upper class, but they're one of the worst offenders, because you have people, full professors making 170,000 plus a year, and 50% of the workers are precarious, and they're living minimum wage basically when you get down to it, and no benefits, nothing.
Yes,
and no way to move. So
yes,
and I had to find a new career as a result. So that was, and I could do that because I had family to help me pay tuition to go back and retrain in something else. But if you don't have that, you know.
Yes. Oh, that is exactly right. And think about it.
And I'm a therapist now who is interested in these issues with people.
Oh,
so,
well,
but of course, the people who need this can't afford me because I'm
Exactly. Thank you so much. This is exactly it. And
that's my rant.
No, you're allowed to rant. We need more ranting. Honestly, we do. It's happening, literally, it's happening in our hospitals. It's happening in our post-secondary system. College faculty went on strike in 2017 to address this very issue. And what happened? They were legislated back to work. And it's not an exaggeration to say that contract faculty are working for less than minimum wage, because it's not just the hours in the classroom, it's the prep time, it's the meeting with students, it's grading papers. Like, there's so much that invisible work that goes into
they're made to reapply every single term for every single course.
Yes. Imagine the waste of time that is. And some people have been doing that for literally 12, 15. In some cases, I knew somebody who had been a contract faculty for 20 years and having to apply every single, And Vivian is asking, well, how do we get laws changed with Doug Ford's? That's an excellent question. And yes, there should definitely be, Lisa was saying there should be stronger penalties for employers who prevent employees from organizing. That is totally true. And let me just move along to the next slide, because that is also in our list of demands. So make employers follow the law. And like, even paying wages, like, wage theft is an actual thing. At the Workers' Action Center, we have dozens of cases of workers who are owed wages by employers who refuse to follow the basic law of paying them what they're supposed to be paid. And we have to do like rallies outside these workplaces and, and public campaigns. And even when workers go to the labor board and get a ruling in their favor, there's no mechanism for the labor board to follow up to make sure those employers actually pay the wages that are owed. So I agree with you. Every violation of the law has to have meaningful penalties, because otherwise a little slap on the wrist and a little fine, it's like, corporations are just going to say, well, if we're allowed to, rip people off, it's, and we just have to pay, $100 here or there. Well, then of course they're going to do it. And I want to leave you with this one thought. There's about 2 million workers who earn less than $20 an hour. If those workers are only shortchanged by just $1 each year, that is $2 million of lost wages that are going to corporations and not going into workers' pockets. And that's if they just basically take $1 away. Imagine some workers are owed 10, 20, thousands of dollars. So this is a huge problem that harms the economy, because that's money that doesn't go into our local communities. It's money that can't support small businesses. And I hear you, corporations are literally getting away with murder, long and deaths on the job, injuries on the job, wage theft, misery on the job. And and especially, for workers who are trying to form unions, all of those things. And that's actually another demand of the campaign, is that we actually need laws that make it much easier for workers to join a union. Have any of you ever been in a union or tried to form a union? And again, shout out or put it in the chat. Or wish you had a union even? No union. Oh yeah. Oh, retired teacher. Oh, okay. Well, Lisa, okay, I feel you. Well, that's the thing. It's like, we need to be able to organize as workers. We need to be able to freely sign cards without feeling like we're going to get fired. And I think that's a huge problem. But also there's a lot of little workplaces, the Tim Hortons that was referred to earlier. Those little franchises are considered small businesses, even though they're actually a tentacle of a big corporation. And so we want to make sure that franchises have to bargain with workers collectively. So it's not left to little tiny groups of workers here and there to take on every little franchise operation. They'll be doing it till the cows come home. And Louise is saying that she was part of a union. And oh, wow, Louise, do you want to share that experience a little bit? What were you on strike for?
I was part of OPSU, the Ontario Public Service Union, when Mike Harris was elected. And we had 5 weeks off, and it was horrible because we struck in the winter and it was cold, and he really was thinking that we would give up. It was a very nasty experience for all concerned, but and I was at the lowest of the pay grades at the time. Wow. And it was a year before I paid back my family, who lent me money to keep groceries on the table.
Yeah.
But it was worth it.
Yes. And why do you say it was worth it?
Because if you give up the ground, you never get it back. And even though we didn't really win our demands, the next time negotiations came, they knew that we were serious when we said we'd go on strike.
Yes, 100%. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember that strike, and I was on the picket lines in solidarity with you many times, but that's what Mike Harris was trying to do, is trying to smash the union. And so one of the tactics that governments are using more and more is, when there's a successful strike, they're introducing laws that make it illegal for us to have autonomy over our bodies, and basically saying you're not allowed to withdraw your labor. So there's sort of two scenarios they allow. If the strike is, if it's a tough strike and it's not effective, and maybe workers are not all as united as they need to be, they let the thing go on forever and a day to just, really break workers. But the moment you have a successful strike that's actually having an impact and could make changes, the government intervenes with legislation to say, you got to go back to work. So these are things like, not only do we need to make it easier to join unions, but we need to make sure that we have the right to exhaust every possible avenue to improve our wages and working conditions. And this is what's happening with education workers. Like, I know for many of our folks, 39K is more than you would make on minimum wage, but a lot of those workers are custodial staff that would be working at a subcontracted, cleaning company, with probably less than minimum wage because of misclassification and people being framed as independent contractors rather than workers. So these are good jobs in our community. And I'm very keen that we all support the education workers if they're forced to take job action. Because as you were saying, Louise, no one wants to be on strike and lose pay. It's devastating. But at the same time, you have no choice, because if you don't draw a line in the sand somewhere, it just gets worse. And then there's nothing to fight for. At a certain point, you got to fight for what you have and try to improve it. So thank you for sharing. And Lisa is saying, yeah, that Walmart literally closed a store where workers unionized rather than allowing for workers to have a union. And Lisa is saying that unions should be required in every workplace with equal representation at the table. It improves life for everyone and for workers and owners alike. And I really agree with that. But I think that having that unions is the fundamental, is the important point in that equation, because sometimes government will say, oh, we do have worker representation, and they'll just pick a worker, put them on a board somewhere, but that worker has no job protection. So that worker can't take a position that's contrary to the employer. Otherwise, they're going to lose their job, because there's no protect. Right now in law, an employer only has to give notice. They don't have to give a reason for firing a worker. So you can literally be fired for any reason under the sun. And of course, that's a huge racial justice issue as well, because, racism and, and all of that. So anyway, so that's a really important point, but it's also why unions are necessary if there's really going to be, worker representation, because workers need to be accountable to other workers. They need to have autonomy. They can't be at risk of not being able to freely represent workers' interests. And Josh is saying how disappointed he is by reporters, yes, allowing Lecce to go unchecked about his claims about parents' fear of strikes and so forth. I mean, strikes are hard, especially in the education sector, and especially for low-wage workers that don't have childcare. But I think more and more that workers without unions and those of us fighting for a higher minimum wage really see those education workers as part of the fight for decent work. And if they can win $3.25 wage increase, that's going to allow us to win our $4.50 wage increase for the minimum wage. So these are really important demands. And then finally, the last demand is just to make sure that absolutely everybody is included in the laws. And misclassification, I touched on it, but so many companies and gig workers or delivery workers, app-based workers are good examples of this, where a company will say, oh, I don't have a workforce. I just use a series of independent contractors who come in and do a job and then leave again. So people who work for app-based companies like Uber or Skip the Dishes and so forth, they not only are they misclassified, what it means is that they don't get any of the protections under the Employment Standards Act. It means they don't get Canada Pension Plan. It means they don't get employment insurance. And employers love this model of misclassifying, because employers don't want to have to pay their fair share of employment insurance contributions. They don't want to have to pay their fair share of Canada Pension Plan, or even workers' safety and insurance contributions. They don't want any of that, because as we learned from Benjamin Studebaker earlier, their job is to minimize all aspects of labor costs. And so that the not only is part-time incentivized under the law, it's the fines and penalties for misclassifying workers are so little that it makes far more business sense for corporations to just misclassify than to actually follow the law. And right now, gig workers, oh yeah, and Lisa is saying, yeah, Uber workers have been fighting and have been declared employers. Same thing is happening in Ontario. A delivery worker filed a claim with the Ministry of Labour. It ruled in favor that worker is an employee. And now the Ontario government is trying to change the law to create a third category of worker that would allow them to not have the full rights under the law. And they're pretending that it's a way of giving gig workers access to benefits. And so Uber really wants this, because what they want to do is give people a crappy benefit plan that's nowhere near what people would get if they got EI or proper, other benefits that would go along with being a worker, because it gives them this huge advantage of paying workers less than they're owed. So watch for that. And when you hear portable benefits and how they're working for workers, you'll know it's rubbish. It's really dangerous. And Gig Workers United, featured in this photograph, are fighting very hard and organizing gig workers for this. And Louise is also saying that misclassification. Oh yes, Louise, do you mind sharing? I would love to hear what.
I don't mind, because it was a very interesting experience. My daughter worked in a small independent retail store for minimum wage. She was part-time. And the employer decided, there's 3 employees, decided that it would be better if they were contract workers, because they would get more money, because then they wouldn't have any deductions off their pay, right? So the other 2 workers said, sure. My daughter was like, really? I don't think that's right. But she went along with it because she knew her hours would be cut if she didn't go along, right? So she talked to the labor board. She kept track of all the information. And then when she left that company, she went to the labor board and she got $800 back because they didn't pay vacation pay, sick pay, like they didn't pay anything. But it meant also that if that company had gone out of business, she wouldn't have been eligible for EI.
Exactly.
So, but the other workers, to them, it was a raise because they didn't have to pay deductions anymore. So, yeah, and there are lots of little small stores that are trying that on.
Incredible. It's incredible. That's a great story, and good for your daughter. I'd love to meet her someday, because good for her for fighting back. But you can imagine how desperate people are. Like, even if people know they're going to lose their pension contributions and so forth, when your wages are so low in the present, it's hard to think about the future, because you just need that extra money to get groceries or make rent, And then, yeah, the side hustle, this notion that everyone is trying to survive and stringing together multiple jobs. One other evil aspect of this legislation the government is putting through is this notion that app-based workers would only be paid for engaged time. And what that means, is that basically if a delivery worker was waiting for an order or, traveling to pick up an order, that wouldn't be engaged time. The engaged time is only when you're actually delivering an order, or when you actually have a passenger in your car that you're driving someone. But the time to and the time in between is not paid. And that is a really huge problem. In other jurisdictions where Uber's been able to get that legislation in place, people have lost half their wages as a result of it. And imagine a coffee shop where wait staff were only paid for the time there was customers at the table, or a retail outlet where you were only paid when the customer was at the till. Like, it's just ways, again, of reducing wages, all for corporate greed. So these are the things that are coming at us that we're trying to organize around. And then this is the last of our demands. And again, we have to end misclassification. There's all sorts of exemptions to the Employment Standards Act that companies have negotiated with government to say, let's just take out these kinds of workers. Let's take away technology workers out. And Josh is saying, yes, the misclassification is a huge problem for truck drivers. And truck drivers are actually federally regulated. So not only is misclassification of truck drivers rampant, but it's exactly right. They're not being paid while they're waiting to access the warehouse. And flight attendants, have you heard about flight attendants? They're only paid while the airplane is in the air. So a steward has to turn up for work, get the passengers in, and if there's a delay on the tarmac, and we've all, heard of that happening, they're not paid for any of the time that they do, that they get customers settled, that all that prep work and so forth. It's only the time in the air. So it is a huge, huge problem everywhere. And again, they're just trying to find any possibility of shortchanging us to maximize this incredible wealth inequality. But the beautiful thing is, and maybe I'll just, again, bring it back full circle to where we started, is that even though we're isolated and we're fragmented and some of us might be retired, or some of us may be unemployed, or raising our kids full time at this particular moment, workers actually do have a lot of power if we can get ourselves together. And somebody asked the question, how do we make Doug Ford do the right thing? And it's definitely going to be a tough road to hoe, I think, under this government. It's not going to be easy, but really we have to unite, and we are the 99%, and the billionaires really are the 1%. And the only way the billionaires stay in power is when the 99% of us are divided and fragmented, and they spend a lot of time trying to pit us against each other. They try to pit the good immigrants from the bad immigrants, you know, the undocumented, you know, the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, the hard workers and the not so hard workers. Like, they're always trying to pit us against each other. And then of course, racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, all of those things, always trying to make us more mad at each other than we are at, you know, Jeff Bezos and Galen Weston. So one of the strategies that we've been trying to do is to just try to show the common denominators of all of our struggles. And on that note, maybe I'll stop sharing my screen for this moment, and I'll put some links in the chat, because I really feel like the education workers' fight is a very important one. You know, just, I think, was it, I'm forgetting whether it was Louise or Lisa. Oh no, it was Louise that was on strike with OPSU. These education workers, if they could win a decent wage increase, it's going to make all of us feel like it's possible to fight and win. But I feel like we really need to raise public support in support of them. And what we've been encouraging people to do, is to make their private support for education workers, and I know there is a lot of private support for them, but to try to make it more visible and more public, so that the workers feel supported and they can see how much public support they have. And if we can identify our community group or our church or whatever affiliation we have, that would be absolutely fantastic. And I see Danielle has a hand up.
Yeah, it was just from back when Louise was talking about her daughter, and talking about, she mentioned the EI thing. And that's also with the university people, because their contract, and if they don't get renewed when they reapply, there's nothing. They have no EI fallback either. So.
No, that's 100% correct. Everything is affected when our wages stay low. Everything else that is based on our wages stays low. So it's a really important point. When our hours and our wages are low, sometimes an employer will come along and say, we'll give you this bonus. We'll give you this one-time bonus. It's better than a wage increase. But what that means is that your wages still are stagnant, your EI, and even what you get on EI, like, because EI itself is only 55% of wages, which if you're on minimum wage, it's a joke. Like, you can't live on 55% of the minimum wage. And on that point, I do want to say something about this notion that the Canada Recovery Benefit is created the labor shortage, because think about what happened when COVID first hit. Like, they implemented that emergency program pretty quickly, and this pretty, you know, correctly, they made it very easy to get, and that was totally the right decision. But almost like, we have a higher minimum wage in Ontario than most other places in Canada, and most other places in Canada, like especially in the Atlantic and in the prairies, workers would have earned less as full-time on minimum wage than they would have gotten on CERB, and yet we did not have a collapse of our frontline minimum wage workers. Right across the country, those workers went to work. They've stocked the grocery shelves. They delivered our food. They worked the warehouses. So that is just rubbish, that some sort of federal program is going to create a disincentive for people to work. Those workers worked in really dangerous circumstances, and some of them paid with their life, some of them paid with their health, and we owe it to try to get those wages and working conditions back up. Louise, I see your hand.
I wanted to offer some hope. I worked in the Ontario Public Service for 30 years. I'm retired now. And someone asked, how do we get things done with Ford elected? And I wanted to just say, you have to play the long game. Ford will not be there forever. And even though you might be feeling like you're banging your head against the wall, it's not wasted effort, because you're tilling the ground and planting the seeds for the next government. And even if you don't win anything, you feel, what have I done? the public servants are listening, and I can tell you that they are on your side and they endure. And so those public servants, when the next government's elected, they'll be into the new government saying, you know what, this is a real issue we need to deal with. And also, of course, it becomes an election issue, and whoever's elected next will know that it's important. So keeping it front and center in the public eye and in the media. And even though it might feel like you're losing a battle, you're not really, because it's a longer game. And I know it's hard because you look at another 4 years and you're like, oh no, but having been in the public service a long time, I did see things that the soil was tilled and prepared, and then change of government, and the first thing they did was pass that legislation.
Yes.
So I wanted to share that.
100%. Barca.
How we are at the things that we are trying to change, and I was thinking, because I'm part of a coalition called Open Work Permit, coalition, and so that migrant workers are among the most vulnerable workers in Canada, and one of their vulnerability also comes because their work permit is majority of workers who come here, they come on a work permit, and their work permit is tied to their employers. So while Canadian workers have at least the mobility to change to change employment, migrant workers don't have this luxury. So there is a campaign, and I'm hoping that people will support the campaign for calling the government for open work permits for migrant workers. I will drop the link in the chat. There is an official petition going on that is sponsored by Jenny Kwan. I hope people can sign the petition, but also share the petition. And the other one you also mentioned, Pam, is the regularization of status for all for migrant workers. So I will drop in the chat another link for that's a petition by the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, asking the government to start, let's give people status and let's make people protected. So I will drop those two links. I hope that people support both campaigns. They are not competing campaigns. Open work permit campaign is different than the regularization for all campaign, so we need both of them.
100%. Thank you so much. I didn't have the link for the open work permit campaign. I did have the other link, but if you can pop that in the link, that would be great. And Louise, I really appreciate your comments. And I do want to say even Doug Ford, and so just a quick recap on everything that the fight for decent work has accomplished. Like, we were able to get the minimum wage increased from $11 an hour to $14, and it should have been $15, but then Doug Ford canceled it. But then Doug Ford canceled it, but then he had to bring it back because the outrage and so forth. So if you keep fighting, you never know. And even when, the previous government brought in, the path to 15, we had been campaigning. It was the Liberals that moved the minimum wage to $11 an hour. And then they basically said, that's all we're going to do. We're going to, and we fought for and won indexation, which is very important, as we're now experiencing. It's not everything, but it's important. But they said, that's it. That's all we're going to do. But we fought and fought and fought. And it was like, no, yes. And you never quite know when they're going to say yes. And that's the same thing with Doug Ford. First thing he does is cancel 15, but he had to bring back 15 last January. And now with the wage adjustment that just happened on October 1st, that 15 is now 1550. We made that happen. So that is really important. And it is true, we lost our paid sick days, but then Doug Ford had to it is a crappy scheme, but he had to deliver the three, it's called worker income protection benefit. And it's this ridiculous thing where people have once in their lifetime, they can take three days and apply for the funding afterward. It's not enough, but we forced him to implement that, which he didn't want to do. He kept saying the federal benefits are enough. So we forced him to do that. And I really do think, like, the education workers have a really good shot at winning if we can support them. And I know we're just about at time, but let me share my screen one more time, because there's a couple of things that are coming up that I think are really important for us to plug into. So first of all, I'm going to share screen, go to my, here on our website, we have a whole page that is devoted to showing, like, helping people understand what the issues are And the more, we're basically asking people to paint the province purple. So we'll send, if you want, you can go on this webpage and you can order posters. We'll send you ribbons. If you're in Toronto, you can pick them up outside the Workers' Action Center. But the idea is we want to put these posters everywhere so that MPPs see the support in the communities, that Doug Ford sees the support in the communities as well. But we also have an emergency phone action, and that we really want to encourage as many people as possible to participate. We are going to come together in a Zoom meeting like this. We're going to go over the talking points, and then we're all going to phone cabinet ministers and our own MPP to say, get back to the bargaining table, get those, start funding education properly, because it isn't just about wages. They're fighting for safe classrooms for our kids. I was shocked to learn they don't even clean. This is before COVID. They weren't even cleaning classrooms every day. There's been so many cutbacks. So part of having a healthy school is about adequate staff, adequate supports, and so forth. So those are two things that you can do every day. Paint the province purple, and we'll send you whatever you need for that. But if you could do one thing this week, I would totally encourage you to please, please, please come to the Phones app, and I'm going to pop the link in the chat so that you can register right now. And it'll make a huge difference that if we have 40 people on the call, we can set into motion hundreds of phone calls, and we'll have the confidence to do that again in our local communities.
Thank you, Pam. What day is that Phones app?
Oh, good, very good question. It's this Wednesday, November 2nd at 7 p.m.
Oh, great.
And one of the things we're trying to do is like Purple Wednesdays. So, Wednesdays is a day to wear purple, to, take a picture of yourself with a poster, go talk to parents at a local school, that kind of thing. But this coming Wednesday, if you can do one thing, join the emergency phones app, because it is, like Louise and others have been saying, it's only when MPPs start to sweat in their communities that they take these issues seriously. So the more people we can mobilize, the better. And for anyone who participates, if you all would like me to help you organize a similar action on your own time at a time that may be better for you, I'd be happy and honored to play that role in any way. So I think that's it. And yes, and just to say we can do it. And I really think the education workers have a good shot. So I don't want to leave on a note of despair. We won 15, we lost 15, we got 15 back. We're going to get 20. We're definitely going to get paid sick days either now or in the next election. And all that is going to make a huge difference.
And we hugely appreciate your work and your sharing your analysis and your insights. And thank you for calling us into this as well and helping us to find some ways that we can be supportive. As we wrap up, I just want to offer you my thanks as well and invite folks if they want to show some appreciation. That would be great.
It was absolutely amazing. I really appreciated hearing your presentation. It was great.
You all are amazing. You made my day. You charged my batteries. I'm ready for like another day on the front lines. So thank you all so much.
Well said.